what would you expect to be the key pillars, so to say, of the Kishida foreign policy? What will change, and what will be the elements that will be continuing, of course, from the past?
You know, the basic position of Japan sort of defines the perimeter of Japan's diplomatic policies. So don't expect much change. More or less, there's going to be a lot of continuation from the previous administrations. That's the basic point, I think. You know, it's very easy to see for Japan, our relations with the United States is so important. You know, that's common sense, isn't it? But also our relations with China is very important for us too. So emotionally, people have a lot of ideas about what the Chinese have been doing in the past years. However, it just showed in the most recent survey that 66% of the Japanese find our relations with China very important. So any prime minister would have to try and stabilize and develop our relations with China. So that's been the policy all along. And I think that's going to continue.
My question would be a little bit hard. Beyond articles and analysis in the regular media, on the market, there are also books which try to explore if China's rise can trigger a war in the next 2 decades. What do you think? Because I see such literature from experts here in Paris. I read the books published also in the US. What is your opinion regarding this issue?
You know, China is really an amazing country in many ways. So we shouldn't be surprised by anything. Anything could happen in China. So we really have to be careful and see to it that there will be no war between us and China, not only in the next 10 years, not only in the next 20 years, but forever, because that's going to be devastating to all of us, right? But we should never rule out the possibility. We should never be relaxed that everything is going to be okay. That's not guaranteed. So we all have to work hard, I think, increasingly work harder to maintain peace and stability in the region. That's how I think.
That means also on the side of working harder on the side of military alliances, I suppose.
I think we need to do two things at the same time, unless China changes its course. That's another question. If China changes their behavior and the direction in which they are developing themselves, but if they continue to increase their military might, if they continue with their maritime advancements, then there's no way but we try and balance this rise of China. But that's one side of the story, isn't it? If we only did that, there's only going to be an arms race and increasing tension. So at the same time, we have to try and have dialogues with the Chinese. We should not misunderstand the intentions of each side. And we should try and find ways to cooperate here and there so that we can enhance confidence. We can build confidence and trust. So two things we should do at the same time. We should never forget that doing only one thing is not enough. So doing both sides of things is necessary for both sides, not only for us, but also for China.
If you could, I would like to give us a sense about how is the Taiwanese issue perceived in Japan, because we see a lot of discussion now lately in the United States to end there are calls to end the strategic ambiguity. On the other side, we see the Taiwanese issue referenced in the G7 statements, in the bilateral statements between US and Japan. And to my surprise, to some extent, I've seen also the Japanese defense minister early in the summer saying that the Taiwan issue is critically linked to the security of Japan. And that to me sounded like a de facto inclusion of Taiwan in the defense perimeter, so to say, of Japan. So it will be important for us to understand how it is perceived, this issue in Tokyo and in Japanese society also, yes.
Yes, we are increasingly worried about the situation because, as you know, there's been a lot of things happening around Taiwan, increased military activities, and naturally we are most concerned because we are so close to Taiwan. And as I mentioned, not only avoiding war between us and China is important, but any hostilities in this part of the world is going to be devastating. So it's okay for China to claim that Taiwan is part of China, but you know, whatever issues you have, you should solve them in a peaceful way, because once you wage war, that is going to affect us all. And therefore, we are trying to prevent any hostilities. That's the main thing, or that's the only aim that we have. We don't want to invade China or, you know, or anything of that. That's all. We just want to prevent any outbreak of action, military hostilities, because once that happens, I want to repeat, it's going to be terrible. It's going to be devastating for everybody. So we are concerned. There's no doubt about that. But we really hope we can solve whatever issues that exist in a peaceful way.
What is your assessment in how America deals with China's rise now, also under this current administration?
You know, when the Chinese began their maritime advancement in the East China Sea, like the fishing trawler collision incident, 2010, this increase in the boats that they sent to the Senkaku Islands, 2012, the Americans didn't take it very seriously. So it was us that told the Americans, you know, the Senkaku issue is not a bilateral issue between Japan and China, but it is going to be a regional issue. It is a global issue because it is about principles. You know, whatever international issues there exist, they should be dealt with in a peaceful way. Neither side should try to change the status quo by physical force. But it was not easy to persuade the Americans that this is not a bilateral issue, but rather a bigger issue that concerns everybody. You know, but now the Americans have got it, and their balance has, as it were, the pendulum has swung completely to the other side. So we are trying to tell them, and I think they understand by now, that it's not only about competition, but we also have to see the cooperative side of our relationship. And this balance is the important thing. So I think now the Biden administration understands that the two-pronged approach of both simultaneous competition and cooperation is necessary, but for many reasons, now the policy is competition first and cooperation second. And I think eventually, however, they will find the right balance between competition and cooperation.
remaining to this issue, broader issue of regional order, so to say, I would, I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that the Quad and the free Indo-Pacific vision, to some extent, are the babies and the legacy of the Prime Minister Abe. So I would like to ask you, how should we understand and decode the meaning and the raison d'etre of the Quad? Because usually here in Europe sometimes is perceived like the initial core of a future Asian NATO. But I want to see your opinion and what binds together, is it the common threat assessment or the values of the broader region? And if you could also think about what could be the next level of the Quad.
Thank you. Well, the free and open Indo-Pacific is a vision that the Japanese are trying to promote. But it consists in concrete terms by all sorts of projects. Yes. So yesterday, if you were at the lecture, I likened China's BRI to a constellation, and I think FOIP is the same. FOIP is like a constellation, but what's important and meaningful are the stars. I mean the projects. So in order to implement these projects, I think Quad is going to be a very helpful framework. You know, not only Japan, but 3 other countries, 4 countries together can promote the creation of these projects in the region, which gives meaning to the vision of FOIP. So I think Quad is a very what's the word to use? Very, powerful and some framework that gives substance to the FOIP vision. That's how I see it. And of course, when we organize the Quad, China is very much in the minds of the 4 countries. There's no question about that. And Quad also has 2 aspects, the security aspect and the cooperation aspect. But because of many considerations like how India would like to treat this, how other countries would see Quad, at the moment we are trying to place the cooperative side of Quad at the forefront, right? And AUKUS is something that is focusing only on the security side of things. So all these different frameworks should substantiate the vision of FOIP. That's how I understand this, the relationship between these different frameworks.
Just to clarify a little bit, this vision of free and Indo-Pacific, what does it mean concretely? Because we see all the all the challenges that China posed to the freedom of navigation movement, and we need to understand also what the FOIP is all about.
Well, FOIP is a vision to establish an order in the Indo-Pacific region, which is supported by rule of law and which is open to anybody, everybody. And, it's going to be secure, safe. And on that basis, we think we can develop the region. The region can thrive only on the basis of a free and open and order that is based on rules and on rules-based order. So that's what we aim for. And I don't think anybody is against that. Even the Chinese say that freedom of navigation is fine, So, and they have their own understanding of rule of law. However, the term rule of law is not something that is negated by the Chinese. They can accept the rule of law, of course, in their own way, but there is some basis on which we can discuss cooperation to realize, to implement the rule of law, there is some room where we can both agree upon. And I have high hopes that the Chinese understand the Japanese version of the free and open Indo-Pacific is perhaps something they can accept. Yeah, the American version of the free and open Indo-Pacific, in the past, oftentimes, they emphasized the security side of things. So the Chinese didn't like it. The Global Times often criticized the American strategy of the free and open Indo-Pacific. But if you're careful, you would see no Chinese leader has ever criticized the Japanese version of FOIP. So they understand this, what's the word? There are two aspects in our policies towards China. And as you have noticed probably, the Chinese themselves started to talk about competition and cooperation.
Mhm.
So I have hopes that we can do something together. And that's what Abe, when he went to China in October 2018, promised with the Chinese side. He arranged 52 MOUs on cooperation in a third country, Japan and China cooperating in another country. But it's difficult to find a concrete, suitable project that is profitable. But we will keep on looking for something, and eventually we'll be able to do something together.
Mhm. Thank you.
And in these circumstances, also China already finished with what she had to say in regarding AUKUS. So we saw everything China could or wanted to say regarding this issue, or one can try to anticipate and imagine what kind of answer China could prepare or could afford to prepare on this new player in the region, which is AUKUS.
Well, I don't think China will change very much, because they are realists. So from the realistic point of view, they can reasonably understand what the Americans, Australians, the British are doing. So I don't like what you're doing, but you just go ahead, you do what you think you should do, but we will continue to do what we think we should do. I think that's the basic point. Of course, I criticize you. This is no good. This is Cold War thinking. Whatever criticisms that you have, you will level that to the other side. But at the same time, you kind of understand it from a realist point of view. So, okay, you do it. Okay, we'll do our thing. I think that's the basic attitude.
China remained realist also in its relationship with Russia, because I want to ask you if do you think that there is a Russian-Chinese axis or there isn't, or if that could be, because this is a question, in my opinion, relevant, because history teaches us that these two countries had big ups and downs in their relationships during the Cold War, for example. Yes. So today we see an axis from China to Russia already done or in progress, or in fact we cannot speak about such things, like for example Margalotti wrote recently.
I think you know about Russia much more than us, but
I doubt.
But my basic understanding is these two countries, they will make use of the other side whenever it's to their benefit. And now both sides need each other, so they are approaching each other. Maybe the Russians need the Chinese more than the other way around. But anyhow, for China, now the only reliable big country partner is Russia. So this kind of good relationship between Beijing and Moscow is likely to continue for some time. But does that mean that this relationship is going to develop into an alliance? I think every expert will doubt that. You know, it's not going to be an alliance in which one country will go and defend the other country when that country is attacked by a third one. I don't think it's going to be like that. The Russians will increasingly be worried if the Chinese will keep on growing at this pace and you know, grow big so as to overwhelm the Russian side. So the relationship most likely will be increasingly delicate in that sense. But you know, the relationship is very complicated, isn't it? Because for the Russians, they want the Chinese to invest in Siberia, for example. When I go to Khabarovsk, people will tell me that we are afraid of the long-term effect of the Chinese coming in, but in the short run, we want them to come.
We want them to come, not to stay.
Yeah. So for any country, this relationship with China is a very complicated, delicate one. And I'm sure it's the same with the Russians.
The same point of view the Eastern Europeans has regarding Russia here.
Right.
Not to stay, yeah, sorry.
So it is fair to say that this relationship between Russia and China is more of a convenience alliance, not necessarily a long-term consolidated common path, although both have anti-status quo agendas to some extent. No, so do you see a space of maneuver for the West to peel away and speculate the potential cleavages between the two of them?
Well, some people envisage that, but my personal opinion is, as long as there is a need for the two countries to get close to each other, then it's going to be very difficult for us to drive a wedge, you know. And I see that under the current situation, the Russians will keep on needing the Chinese will keep on needing the Russians. So there's no chance that we will be able to drive a wedge between the two.
Because we brought China more towards Europe through Russia. In this discussion, I would like to ask you if do you think that China's money and its current political influence abroad are enough together to, in fact, are self-leverage, sufficient leverage to push to a strategic shift in Eastern Europe or in a part of Eastern Europe?
I don't really think so. I don't know about East Europe well enough, but my hunch is, first of all, people are rather skeptical about this Chinese money coming in. The money doesn't come in as smoothly and as much as people had expected. You know, promises are not necessarily met. That's one factor. And secondly, related to that is the fact that the Chinese economy is not growing as fast as it used to do. And the Chinese are increasingly cautious about embarking on these projects overseas. And also, I think the more you come to know the Chinese way of doing things, you know, your initial too high expectations are going to be corrected. You know, it's not that the Chinese are terrible. I'm not saying that, you know, but first, when you meet the Chinese, when they greet you, when they treat you well, welcome you in China, you kind of fall in love with China. That often happens with many people. But gradually, this love becomes sort of, it sort of fades. And you begin to see the other side in a more objective way. And that's what happens in most cases, for most countries that start dealing with China. And I think that's going to happen to the East European countries if it hasn't happened yet.
Remaining at this issue of from a European perspective, I would like to ask you, what would you think that the lessons for Europe should be, as you emphasized yesterday in your presentation, the relationship between Japan and China is one based of both competition and cooperation, no, the cooperative part of and dimension. On the other side, in Europe, for so many years, we only saw the issues through the cooperative side, not the geopolitical traditional kind of competition. But it seems that slowly, lately, Europe is waking up to this also, but it's still very slow. So how could you balance the two of them? And in general, what lessons could we take from the Japanese experience and practice in this?
So I think the basic point is you shouldn't expect too much. The Chinese are very pragmatic. They won't do anything out of altruism, but it's give and take. So when you think you're receiving a lot, you should think about what they expect you to give to them, So I think that's the basic lesson. Don't expect too much out of your relations with China. They are very realistic and pragmatic people. And what else? These days, because they have grown so quickly and they have grown so big, at times they could behave in a very high-handed manner and use economic coercion, like they've been doing to Australia and other countries. So, don't put all your eggs in the Chinese basket and try to diversify your economic partners, I think, and political partners for that matter. I think that's the most important lesson.
We had Mao's China, Deng's China, and we have now Xi's China. Which are the differences between these three Chinas? Maybe there are more Chinas, but I think these three are, in fact, the main countries.
Well, in the Maoist days, Mao was serious about pushing with revolution. So politics was very important. Class struggle, in his idea, kept on going even after the socialization of society, even after China declared it has become a socialist nation. And Deng Xiaoping corrected that. He switched the main target of the party from class struggle to economic construction. But in his days, China was still weak, poor. But in Xi Jinping's days, China is big. Its economic power, its military power has grown so much. So that makes a big difference. I can tell you one episode about, do you remember the Prime Minister called Zhou Enlai, who was in the Maoist days? Zhou Enlai in 1973 met a delegation of young American academics who work on China. And in 1973, it was after Nixon's visit, but still no diplomatic relations between Washington and Beijing. So in those days, the delegation consisted of very, very pro-China type of academics. And there was one young female academic in the delegation. And Zhou Enlai asked this young woman, do you think China will ever become hegemonistic in the future? And this young female academic answered, no, sir, that's not possible. China will never become a hegemon. And then Zhou Enlai answered back, you'll never know. You'll never know. But if in the future China became hegemonistic, you have to oppose it. And you have to tell the Chinese people at that time that Zhou Enlai was also against it. And people applauded them. I don't think he was joking. You know, he knew that once, just like a person, a country becomes powerful, the character changes. Character of the person, the nature of the state, you know, changes, and China could change once it's powerful. And that's the China that we are seeing today.
At least with Xi Jinping, is the first time when China doesn't hide its power anymore from the foreigners' eyes. And as far as I understood.
That's very true, because that relates to the domestic situation. Since Xi Jinping wants to tell his own people that I am the man who made China very powerful. Yeah, so you should support me. Don't you think I'm a great man? So this need for continuous efforts to legitimize its power, the power of the Chinese Communist Party, this is very troublesome for outsiders like us. You know, that's the trouble. He has to rely on nationalism.
Let's remain a little bit more on this domestic part of the problem, and I would like to ask you more about these domestic sources of the Chinese conduct in the international arena. You mentioned yesterday in your presentation the balance of power between hardliners and moderates, and something that happened with the now coming in the power of Xi Jinping. So I'd like to ask you, what explains the Chinese shift toward this more assertive, coercive, deeply ethnocentric kind of behavior? And to what extent the mindset of the people, because is important in this broader scheme, because I remember a very popular narrative that the regime is kind of projecting is that of the century of humiliation, now incentivizing the grievances of the people against the West and in general against the Western powers. So yes. Please explain us to a little bit more on these domestic reasons to understand the contemporary behavior of China.
Yes, thank you. There are many points to discuss here. One is in the Maoist days, in Mao's days, they didn't really emphasize the century of humiliation, but rather what they emphasized was, because of the Chinese Communist Party's heroic deeds, leadership, we were able to defeat the imperialists, and we are the victors. Yeah, that was the main narrative. But after Deng, especially after June 4th in 1989, the narrative changed. Now the main line was, we are the victims. We were the victims. You know, century of humiliation. So we have to wake up, stand up, support the party, and unite and fight back. That's the narrative changed. That's point number one. And point number two is China, since the days of Deng, has entered this phase of modernization, very rapid modernization. Yeah? And when a country, not only China, when a country is in the midst of the modernization process, what actually happens is that country must import a lot of European things into your society. Japan experienced that since the Meiji Restoration. We had to catch up very quickly with the powers, and we had to modernize. And what did it mean? We imported a lot of things from Europe. We had to Europeanize a lot of aspects of our society. And this causes friction in society, you know, civilizationally or culturally. How can we combine the new European modernity with our tradition? And it took almost a century or longer for the Japanese to settle with the blend, the right blend that the Japanese can accept. So these days, during daytime, we go and watch traditional sumo wrestling. And then in the evening, we go and watch ballet that came from the West. And there's no contradiction psychologically. It's completely fine. But for the Chinese now, they're going through this very difficult, psychologically difficult period. How much of Europe should we import and include as elements in our daily lives? You know, and they're going to take a longer time, I think, than Japan because of their civilization. History is much longer than ours. Yeah, and in this process, you tend to become anti-Western. The Japanese were like that, so we can sort of understand the sentiment. You know, you tend to be very defensive. You have to defend your tradition against this cultural aggression of the Europeans. And that's the process that the Chinese are going through now. And that's where part of their aggression towards the West comes. So if you read the writings by the Chinese today, you find a lot of West, 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 China versus the West, China versus the West everywhere. Yeah. But in Japan today, you hardly find the word the West. Yeah. And when I was a child, partly because it was still during the Cold War, I could see a lot of East versus West, but no longer, because we have settled down. It's okay for us to be clad in Western clothing, but still we are Japanese and we maintain our tradition. But the Chinese are not quite sure what the final shape of this new civilization is going to be. And that gives them a lot of psychological trouble. And that's part of the source of their nationalistic behavior.
But do you see if that path continues, I mean, on this forced, to some extent, nationalistic diet and with anti-Western, couldn't be this going too far to some extent and not being not being able to compromise anymore? I mean, the leadership needs to be tough on this and might be entrapped in this kind of mindset.
So what we hope is, unlike Japan, which made a big blunder by going into war with all the Western nations, except Germany and Italy and a few others, we hope that the Chinese will change course in a peaceful way. And that is very possible because this is an era of globalization. We find a lot of enlightened or westernized or internationalized bright Chinese, both inside and outside China. I'm sure in Romania also you find a lot of enlightened, internationalized Chinese young people who are completely like us, you know, and who can understand our values. They appreciate Chinese values, but at the same time, they appreciate the Western or the modern values. But the number is not big enough. And since the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like these kids, and therefore, since they are obsessed with this possibility of a color revolution, they are trying to unify what they are taught, nationalize what they are taught. This is Xi Jinping. What Xi Jinping is trying to do now. He doesn't accept multiculturalism, right? He wants to signify everything. He wants to signify religion. He wants to signify all the universities. He doesn't.
You speak about Putin here? Sorry.
So that's what goes on, but even in the leadership, there are some people who are internationalized, who understand the need for reform. So sometimes they have the upper hand. Sometimes they have the upper hand, like their application to the CPTPP. Inside China, there are many who are against this, yeah. But still, the international camp, as it were able to persuade Xi Jinping that this is going to be good for China.
So, do you think is there anybody able to guess how a post-Xi Jinping China could look? And in the first place, I suppose that is already enough difficult to guess when exactly this time of frame will begin.
You know, once I had a very good conversation with a Russian who lives in Khabarovsk, who knows China very well. He's not only an academic, but he has done business with the Chinese people, and he knows a lot about China. We were conversing, and he said that, well, only God knows what's going to happen to China. So I said, I disagree. And he said, what? Why do you disagree with me? I said, even God doesn't know. So it's very hard to predict, but I know that, I think I know that China will change. China will change and become what? No one knows. But this is not, the current situation is not going to stay like this forever.
In fact, do you say that this is we watch an intermediary stage of China's development, yes? Which could last, in case of China, could last even centuries, because it's a big country with a huge history. Yes, you count it in thousands of years, not in hundreds of years. So well, I don't know. It's a good news what you give to us, or it's a bad news, because in the frame time it's so relative.
You know, you're quite right. As I said, anything could happen in China, and we should never be surprised by what happens, or in this case, what does not happen in China. You know, anything could go against our expectations. So I do not rule out the possibility that the CCP dominant rule will continue for, let's say, another half a century or so. But if I was pushed to guess, I would say no, half a century would be too long. I don't think it will last for so long. And no authoritarian regime has survived a big economic crisis. So I think economy is the key. And at the moment, the central government still has enough money to mend things, to fix things here and there. Even if the Honda, the developer, collapsed, maybe if it collapsed tomorrow, the central government can still patch up and maintain the stability, basic stability of society. But eventually, as I said, the economic downturn is going to continue. And if then a big economic crisis hit, I doubt that the regime can hold.
One only sub-question, Octavian, if you may. That means the economy is the key also for China's territorial integrity, because this is another level of China's rise and of China's current problems and of China's history, in fact, the territory and the political unification and the economic unification of its large territory. And one of Xi Jinping's regime main targets are, no coincidence, the Uyghurs, yes, that region of China, which is not so easily to deal with, even by the Chinese Communist Party.
You know, in the days of the dynasties in the past, the Chinese were not so, what's the word, particular about territories. You know, everything was theirs. And the border was, you know, it was not a big issue for China. And it's only in the nationalistic days, that the Chinese became aware of the territory, which is one element of the three major elements of a modern state, you know, together with other elements like sovereignty. And I think, you know, now is the day of nationalism. So people can easily become very emotional about territories. But I wonder if this is going to last forever, not even in China, but in other countries too. But anyhow, in the near future, yes, people will be very conscious about territorial gains or losses and, you know, what have you. But when we take the long-term view of history, as you said, China's history has been unity, division, and this cycle will probably continue in the future too.
They behave even territorially, even in relation to the South China Sea in the end. Now it's what they've done, and in a way pushed the world to awake to a different China, to a different Chinese power. I'm wondering if you see any progress in a way that in the way that the region, that the countries in the region can respond to all those fait accompli in the South China Sea, how they approach it, what they've learned from that, what is the how the things are perceived in the region vis-a-vis that, or is a lost cause, because it seems like a creeping aggression now in the end.
Yes, or we can call it salami slicing. They do bit by bit what they can do. And we are all worried about that. That's not how countries should be conducting their affairs. And therefore, we have to think of all sorts of means to prevent any of those acts, further acts. The focus is the Scarborough Shoal. You know, we don't want the Chinese to construct an artificial island there. And therefore, we still have to count on the Americans, because they are the ones that have the physical force to prevent the Chinese from doing that. We have to be pragmatic, practical when we think about these affairs. So the Southeast Asian nations, they are very pragmatic people. So from an early part of the post-Cold War days, they have approached the US. They have asked the US to stay and not let any power vacuum in that part of the world. But the Americans in the 2010s were not paying much attention. I don't think they're paying enough attention even today to Southeast Asia. But the Chinese made use of that lack of attention, and here we are.
We see a more and more assertive North Korea in that region. So if you can brief us a little bit on what are the expectations there? What are the fears, the analysis, the prognosis in this moment?
Well, I don't think the North Koreans have a specific plan to attack any other country, but they are in grave difficulty economically because of COVID. It's got worse. How much worse, no one knows for sure, but we can easily imagine that they're in deep trouble. So they want to attract attention, and firing these missiles is one measure that they have, taken in the past as well. So once the Biden administration's diplomatic policies become sort of more fully developed, I think there'll be a lot more conversations between the regional nations like Japan, South Korea, China, and the US as to what we should be doing about North Korea. And that's what the North Koreans want too. And they want attention, and I think we will have to give them that.
While everyone expected the withdrawal, the retreat from Afghanistan, many were shocked by the way it was done and how it was executed. I'm wondering, what was the perception in Tokyo, and what were you worried or encouraged because the US will potentially devote more resources to Indo-Pacific and closing a chapter now, the post 9/11 one, and the kind of campaigns and the stabilization campaigns in Middle East, in the broader Middle East. Because on the other side, there are a lot of traditional US allies that seem to be worried about the questioning now the commitment of the United States, the staying power now of the United States. So how was it perceived in the region?
Well, I think the thing that surprised us most was the collapse of the Afghan National Army. Why did they collapse in a matter of a week or a few days? Why were they so vulnerable, so to crumble in such a way? I think that was the biggest surprise. And the Chinese were quick to point out that this is what's going to happen to Taiwan. But no Japanese bought that argument. Taiwan and Afghanistan are very different things. And it will be hard to imagine that the Americans will take the same attitude and behavior in this part of the world in the way that they did in Afghanistan. I think that's the basic idea.
My one of the last questions would be related to China, Europe, European Union. In fact, in the context of German elections, for example, a lot of articles and analyses tried to explore how Germany's relationship with China will evolve in a post-Merkel era. And but I'm not interested exactly on Germany, but on its echoes on the level of European Union's relationship with China. What kind of policy European Union you think has regarding China, and if there is something that could be changed, or in your opinion that should be changed in EU's policy regarding China?
I don't know well enough to comment really, but my hunch is the European policies towards China is going to be very similar to ours. That is basically it's a two-pronged approach. We compete where we have to compete. For the Europeans, the political principles are very important, human rights. Also, they find a lot of potential, economic potential in the Indo-Pacific. So they are agreeable to the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So they will keep on dispatching their boats and the military forces over to the Indo-Pacific. So that should continue. I think that is to the benefit of the European nations. But at the same time, I think Europe will try to reap all the economic benefits that they can through the economic partnership with China. We cannot think of the German car manufacturers pulling out of China. There's no way. And no way Siemens will pull out of China, right? So I think more or less, including the US, we will try to reap benefits where we can and cooperate. But at the same time, we will have to compete with China because they have changed their behavior and sort of challenging our interests. So this contradictory situation, I think, will continue for many countries, including the Europeans.
My last question. So we've seen a structural change in the atmosphere and the approach of Washington and the United States vis-a-vis China over the past few years. So from engagement to competition to some extent. On the other side, with a lot of ripple effects in the Indo-Pacific. Now the reinforcement of alliances and the reinforcement of the Quad, of the AUKUS now lately. But at the same time, we see another trend in the United States, a domestic issue to some extent, a domestic concern about joining the TPP, rejoining the TPP. We see China now that is interested in CPTPP, to some extent. I'm wondering, because I've seen the remarks of Carl Campbell a few months ago, making this point that without a positive economic vision that United States can provide and bring to the Indo-Pacific and in Asia, it will remain always, it will be a problem to give more weight to the Indo-Pacific pivot to some extent. Do you see any or expect any progress on this front? A United States that is ready to provide in terms of economic vision more to the Indo-Pacific, or has that ship sailed already?
Well, TPP originally, the US was not in the original 4 countries that started it, but very soon took it up as a very important economic framework through which they can decide the rules. President Obama said it very clearly that we have to make the rules, otherwise China is going to make the rules. So TPP was the vehicle through which they were going to establish this new economic order, as it were, in this part of the world. However, the internal division, this inclination towards protectionism in the US has prevented them from maintaining this initiative, which is very unfortunate because if the Americans keep on not only not joining the TPP, but also preventing others from joining the TPP, if that happens, other countries will see the US rather as a troublemaker. So we genuinely hope that the Americans will settle this dispute inside their country and come back to TPP. We sincerely hope that will happen, and we are waiting for that. But unfortunately, at the moment, we don't see a lot of hope for that to happen in the near future.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for this very interesting
Most welcome. Most welcome. Fantastic
analysis.
questions. You two are fantastic journalists.
Thank you for your openness to our questions.